In a workshop somewhere between midnight and the first hours of morning, a figure bends over a workbench lit by the soft, trembling glow of beeswax candles. The light catches the edges of glass vessels, alembics, retorts, long-necked flasks with bulbous bottoms, each one containing something that might transform into something else entirely, or might remain forever what it has always been. The uncertainty is part of the practice. The waiting is part of the art. Around this figure, the air hangs heavy with the mingled sense of what chemistry and dream have left behind. There is sulfur, that ancient yellow powder, whose smell is both acrid and strangely mineral, reminiscent of something burned and something alive at once. Beneath it, the gentler notes of mercury vapor, quicksilver, that has been heated and allowed to cool, leaving its metallic breath in the corners of the room. There is ash from the furnace, still warm at its base, and the particular earthiness of groundstone, cinnabar, realgar, compounds whose names sound almost like spells, whose properties remain partly mysterious, even to those who work with them day after endless day. What drives a person to such labor, to spend not weeks but years, sometimes decades, heating and cooling, dissolving and crystallizing, recording observations in cipher and symbolic language that seems designed to hide meaning from those who do not possess the key? What calls someone to believe that somewhere within the hidden architecture of matter itself lies something so perfect, so complete, so thoroughly aligned with the deepest laws of the universe, that it can transform base metal into gold, extend human life beyond its natural span, perhaps even grant something like immortality itself? This question, this peculiar human obsession with transformation at the deepest level, reaches backward and forward across 2,000 years. It touches Egypt's dusty workshops where metallurgists first learned to draw color from metal and shadow. It moves through the luminous libraries of Alexandria, where Greek philosophy encountered Egyptian craft and begat something entirely new. It travels silently through the medieval monasteries of Europe, where monks copied texts by lamplight, preserving knowledge in their steady hands. It flourishes in the courts of kings and emperors, where the desperate hope of turning suffering into cure, corruption into purity, the finite into the infinite, burned as bright and as consuming as any furnace fire. If you have ever wondered how 2,000 years of human ingenuity, mathematics, observation, and yearning coalesced around the search for one substance, the philosopher's stone, if you have ever felt curious about the true history of alchemy, not as superstition or fraud, but as a genuine attempt to understand the hidden mechanisms of the world, then I invite you to subscribe to this journey. We are about to walk together through empires and centuries, through the workshops and minds of seekers who believed that knowledge itself could be transmuted, that understanding could be purified and perfected, until it revealed nothing less than the fundamental nature of creation itself. The midnight workshop where our story truly lives is not a single place but thousands of them, existing across centuries and continents. Yet in each one, a person sits by candlelight, working with their hands and their intellect, driven by a question so profound that it has never truly been answered. What if matter is not inert? What if at the heart of all things, transformation is not just possible, but inevitable? What if the goal is not to create something new, but to reveal what has always been hidden? The candles burn lower, the glass vessels catch and hold the light, and in that suspended moment between what is known and what might be discovered, the search begins again, as it has begun again and again for thousands of years, each generation finding in the ancient texts and the ancient dream something they themselves must pursue, must test, must understand for themselves, even if the answer remains always just beyond the reach of certainty. This is how alchemy truly begins, not with formulas or promises of gold, but with this quiet, consuming desire to look beneath the surface of things, to ask what transformation means, and to trust that somewhere in the intricate dance of heat and matter and symbol, the answer waits. In the amber glow of that workshop, suspended between curiosity and obsession, the alchemist records another formula in margins already crowded with failed attempts and half-understood visions. What he does not know is that he is part of something far larger than himself, a chain of seekers reaching back 2,000 years, stretching across empires that rose and fell, languages that transformed, and continents separated by distances that would take months of difficult travel to cross. The Philosopher's Stone was never simply an object locked within glass vessels or hidden in the retorts bubbling over flame. It was an idea, perhaps the most persistent human idea about transformation itself. And it moved through time the way light moves through water, bending and refracting as it passed through different hands, different minds, different worlds of meaning. To follow this search is to travel not as a tourist visits a museum, but as an anthropologist walks through centuries, meeting people who believed deeply, worked carefully, and often sacrificed much for a dream that history would eventually render impossible. Yet in that impossibility lies something worth the journey. If you have felt drawn to mysteries that span vast stretches of time, to stories where obsession and genuine discovery become difficult to untangle, where the pursuit of one thing reveals unexpected truths about another, we invite you to journey with us through these 2,000 years of alchemical longing. Subscribe now and follow the entire arc of the search for the Philosopher's Stone, from the candlelit workshops of medieval monks to the secret laboratories of Renaissance princes, from the precise measurements of Islamic researchers to the moment when alchemy finally transformed into the chemistry that would build the modern world. The path ahead winds through Alexandria's great library, where knowledge from 3 civilizations converged in the morning light. It passes through the courts of Islamic caliphs where systematic experimentation was treated as a form of prayer. It moves northward through trade routes into medieval Europe, where priests and scholars in stone monasteries continued the work by candlelight, believing that mastery of matter was a path toward understanding the divine. And it extends finally into the courtly laboratories of the Renaissance, where wealthy patrons funded increasingly elaborate experiments in rooms that smell of sulfur and possibility, where the line between genuine science and clever fraud becomes nearly invisible. Along this route, you will meet perhaps 200 individuals whose names were recorded, and thousands whose names vanished, each convinced that they were approaching the threshold of something transformative, something that would change not only matter itself, but the human relationship to time, to aging, to mortality. What makes this 2,000-year search so luminous in memory is not that the Philosopher's Stone was ever found. It was not. Alchemists failed with remarkable consistency across centuries and continents, and yet in that failure lies an unexpected success. The apparatus they developed to pursue the impossible became the laboratory. The questions they posed about the nature of matter, hidden properties, transformation through heat and pressure, the very notion that base substances might contain hidden dignity within them, these shaped not mystical thinking alone, but the foundations of chemistry, medicine, pharmacology, metallurgy. They built a bridge, whether they intended it or not, from wonder toward understanding. To follow this entire story is to understand something profound about human consciousness itself. We are creatures who cannot help but search for transcendence within the material world. We want to believe that ordinary things contain extraordinary potential. We want to imagine that time itself might be mastered, that decay might be reversed, that the secret to renewal lies waiting in some hidden formula we have not yet discovered. The alchemists took these deep human desires and gave them laboratory form. They asked whether these impulses might be written in the laws of nature, rather than merely in the human heart. For 2,000 years, they investigated. For 2,000 years, they failed to find what they sought. And in failing, they found almost everything else worth finding. The story spreads across geography in ways that surprise. It does not move in a straight line from west to east or south to north, but rather pulses and flows like a heartbeat across continents. Knowledge moves along trade routes. It travels with refugees fleeing persecution. It passes through translations that sometimes clarify and sometimes obscure. It survives in fragments, in marginalia, in notebooks hidden in monastery cellars for centuries before scholars recognized their value. The Philosopher's Stone, in its truest form, may have been impossible, but the search for it was entirely real, and the minds that conducted that search were some of the most careful, most disciplined, and most imaginative observers of the physical world in their eras. As we move deeper into this account, you will find that distinctions between the mystical and the practical become surprisingly blurred. The Islamic alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan, working in the 8th century, conducted what would be recognized today as rigorous chemistry, developing procedures for distillation and crystallization that remained unsurpassed for centuries. And yet he was absolutely convinced that all matter contained an internal spirit, a hidden animation that could be awakened by the skilled practitioner. Was he a chemist or a mystic? The question assumes we understand these categories as fixed, as we do now. But in his time, in his mind, in the world of his experience, no such separation existed. The matter was animated, the spirit was material. To study one was to study the other. This brings us to something worth considering as we settle into the deeper layers of this account. The search for the Philosopher's Stone was never truly a search for a single substance, though the alchemists themselves often believed it was. It was, more profoundly, an attempt to articulate a question that still haunts human consciousness. Are the capacities for transformation, for healing, for renewal, for the transcendence of limitation, hidden somewhere in the physical world, waiting to be discovered? Or must we accept that the material universe operates according to laws that are, in their fundamental nature, indifferent to human longing? The alchemists answered by continuing to work, by continuing to experiment, by continuing to believe that somewhere in the marriage of human intention and natural law, something miraculous might be revealed. That belief sustained them through failure after failure across centuries. That same belief, transformed into the methodology of science, would eventually birth a modern world capable of achievements the medieval alchemist could not have imagined. But this is getting ahead of ourselves. For now, settle back into the candlelit workshop. Watch the alchemist bend over his work and prepare to follow the entire journey, from the ancient Egypt where the very concept of alchemy was born to the moment when it finally became something new. The very word alchemy itself carries within it the dust of ancient Egypt, and to understand where the search for the Philosopher's Stone truly began, we must travel backward through time to a land the ancient Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land, named for the rich dark soil deposited each year by the flooding of the Nile. It was in this place, some 25 centuries before the candlelit workshops of medieval Europe would arise, that humans first began to systematically transform matter and ask the question that would echo through 2 millennia. What is the fundamental nature of all things, and can we remake them into something else? The Egyptians were, in many ways, the world's first practical chemists, though they would not have known that word. They were miners and metalworkers, dyers and physicians, people who understood through patient observation and repeated trial that certain materials possessed hidden properties that could be unlocked through heat, moisture, grinding, fermentation. Picture the Egyptian metallurgist in the 3rd millennium before Christ, heating copper ore in a furnace, watching it slowly transform into molten metal. To him, this was not merely a craft, it was an act that bordered on the sacred, a conversation with the invisible forces that moved through the world. The metal had been hidden in the stone, and through knowledge and intention, it could be drawn out. If copper could be hidden in stone, what else might be hidden in matter? What other transformations might be possible? The Egyptians became master metalworkers, combining copper with tin to create bronze, a material harder and more useful than either metal alone. They worked gold with such precision that some of their ornaments have never been surpassed. They created glass, a material so strange and unlike anything found in nature that it seemed to observers almost magical. Sand, transformed by fire into something transparent and beautiful. They prepared dyes from plants and minerals, learned to preserve bodies through mummification using natron and resins, fermented grain into beer and wine. Each of these processes involved understanding that matter could be hidden, masked, transformed, combined with other matter to create something new. And this is perhaps the deepest root of what would become alchemy, the recognition that the visible world is not fixed and final, that beneath the surface of things lies the possibility of metamorphosis. The Egyptians did not separate this knowledge into the neat categories that later cultures would create: chemistry here, medicine there, spirituality somewhere else. For them, transformation of matter and transformation of the soul were bound together. When they mummified the dead, they were preserving the body not merely as a vessel, but as a continuation of life in another realm. The substances they used, natron, frankincense, myrrh, were believed to carry within them spiritual properties that aligned with physical preservation. The word alchemy itself, we should pause here and acknowledge, has origins that scholars still gently debate. It likely derives from the Arabic alchimia, but the root before that stretches further back, possibly to the Egyptian chem or chemia, which simply meant Egyptian or the art of Egypt. Or perhaps it came from the Greek chemeia, meaning the art of mixing or alloying metals. Both etymologies point to the same truth, that alchemy was understood as the ancient art, the knowledge that belonged to Egypt, the land that had practiced the transformation of matter longer than any other civilization the Greeks and Arabs could name. By the time the Greek world encountered Egyptian knowledge, directly and indirectly, the Egyptians had already been working with metals, minerals, and natural substances for thousands of years. There existed a sophisticated understanding of how to extract, refine, imitate, and combine materials. And alongside this practical knowledge flourished a deeper mythology, the idea that all matter contained within it divine essence, that transformation was possible not merely in the workshop, but in the heart and spirit of those who performed the work. The god Thoth, associated with wisdom and alchemy, was depicted recording the secrets of the universe. The god Ptah was the divine craftsman who spoke all things into being. What would later alchemy inherit from Egypt, then, was not a single recipe or formula, but rather a way of thinking about the world, a conviction that matter was fluid, transformable, and that the person who understood the hidden connections between things possessed real power. It was a conviction born from centuries of practical experimentation, but clothed in myth and symbol, because that was how knowledge was preserved and transmitted in the ancient world. The secret was not written down plainly, for secrets guarded by sacred associations were secrets preserved. The Nile Valley alchemists, as we might call them, worked not in universities or academies, but in temples and workshops, in the chambers where priestly knowledge was guarded and transmitted from master to apprentice. Their texts, when they were written, were encoded in symbolic language partly from necessity. Such knowledge was precious, and partly from genuine conviction that certain truths could only be understood through patient meditation on symbols rather than through bare description. If you were to read such a text, you would find references to kings and queens, to dragons and sacred birds, to marriages and deaths, to the changing of colors from black to white to red. Were these instructions for actual physical processes, or were they symbolic descriptions of spiritual transformation? Or was the question itself a false one, assuming a division that the ancient Egyptians did not make? What seems clear as we stand at this threshold between the ancient world and the cultures that would inherit its wisdom is that alchemy did not spring up suddenly in the medieval period with no roots, no precedent. It was not invented by charlatans seeking gold or by deluded mystics. Rather, it grew from a long and genuine tradition of seeking to understand and transform the material world, a tradition that took material processes seriously and treated them as sacred simultaneously. The Egyptians did not find the philosopher's stone, of course, but they built the conceptual foundation upon which that search would be constructed. They demonstrated that matter could be read like a text, that it held secrets, and that those secrets could be unveiled through combination of careful observation, systematic experiment, and the conviction that the cosmos itself operated according to knowable principles that repeated in miniature in the workshop as they repeated in the vast movements of the heavens. When the armies of Alexander the Great swept across the ancient world, something unexpected happened in the wake of conquest. The great general died young, and his empire fragmented. But one city rose to become the intellectual heart of three civilizations meeting at once. Alexandria, founded on the edge of the Mediterranean in the Nile Delta around 331 before the Common Era, became a place where Greek mathematical precision, Egyptian mystical knowledge, and the practical wisdom of countless captured and traded peoples converged into something entirely new. It was here, in this bustling port city where merchant ships carried goods from India and the Red Sea, that alchemy, as we understand it, was truly born. Picture the library and museum of Alexandria in those early Hellenistic centuries. Scholars from across the known world gathered to study, to teach, to debate in courtyards and lecture halls. The Greeks brought their love of philosophy and geometry, their habit of asking why and how things worked. The Egyptians, whose temple priests had guarded secrets of metallurgy and the transformation of metals for countless generations, found themselves living alongside these curious foreigners who wanted to understand the principles behind their ancient craft. It was not conquest in the brutal sense, but rather a collision of knowledge systems, each one curious about the other. Over decades and then centuries, these traditions began to blend. The rigid categories of thought that had once kept these worlds separate began to dissolve. The Egyptian smiths and metallurgists had known for thousands of years how to work with metals, how to alloy them, how to create surfaces that gleamed like gold through careful chemical treatments. They had developed processes, some of them quite sophisticated, to change the appearance and properties of common metals. When Greek philosophers encountered these techniques, they wondered, might there be a deeper principle at work here? Might there be a hidden unity beneath the diversity of substances in the natural world? What if transformation itself was not merely a human art, but a fundamental law of nature? In this environment, a body of texts emerged that would shape alchemical thinking for the next 2,000 years. These works were attributed to a figure of legendary antiquity, a teacher said to be impossibly old and impossibly wise. Hermes Trismegistus. The name meant Hermes the thrice great, and according to tradition this being lived in the distant past, possessing knowledge that transcended mortal limitations. Whether Hermes Trismegistus was ever a single historical figure remains uncertain. Most scholars today believe the texts attributed to him were written by various hands over centuries, compiled and recompiled, layered with commentary and interpretation. But the idea of him, the image of an ancient master who had penetrated the deepest mysteries of transformation and the cosmos, became extraordinarily powerful. What did these hermetic texts teach? They spoke of a universe governed by correspondence and sympathy, by hidden connections between the visible and invisible worlds. They presented alchemy not merely as a craft for working with metals, but as a spiritual and philosophical system. The Hermetic authors, writing in Greek but drawing on Egyptian thought and gradually incorporating Platonic and Stoic philosophy, proposed that all matter was connected, that all substances were in some sense expressions of a single underlying principle. They suggested that through proper understanding and proper technique, a skilled practitioner might accelerate or control the natural processes of transformation. The metallurgist working in his workshop was not simply following a trade, but participating in the deeper mysteries of creation itself. The Hermetic texts were not organized as clear instruction manuals. They were written in deliberate obscurity, in riddling language and symbolic imagery. Some scholars believe this obscurity was intentional, a way of hiding dangerous knowledge from the uninitiated. Others suggest it reflected the genuine difficulty of expressing philosophical concepts that did not fit neatly into ordinary language. Whatever the intention, the result was a body of work that invited endless interpretation and commentary. Each generation of alchemists who encountered these texts saw in them something different, projected their own assumptions and hopes onto the mysterious passages. This very quality of opacity gave the texts their enduring power. They could not be definitively refuted or exhausted. They remained forever open to new meaning. Within the Hermetic corpus was a particular fascination with the principle of unity within multiplicity. The universe, these texts suggested, operated according to laws of correspondence. What happened above in the realm of the stars corresponded to what happened below in the realm of matter and the human body. The macrocosm and the microcosm reflected one another. This idea, which we will explore more deeply in a moment, became foundational to alchemical thought. It offered a way of thinking about transformation that was not simply mechanical or material, but spiritual and cosmic all at once. It suggested that by understanding the principles at work in one domain, one could illuminate the principles at work in another. The Hellenistic alchemists of Alexandria did not simply inherit Egyptian craft knowledge and Greek philosophy and leave them unchanged. Instead, they began to synthesize them into something genuinely new. They started keeping systematic records of their experiments with metals and minerals. They developed new apparatus, new techniques, new theoretical frameworks to explain what they observed. They were, in many ways, doing real chemistry, even if they did not call it that, and even if their theoretical understanding was deeply intertwined with philosophy and spirituality. They created the crucible and the alembic, the distillation apparatus that would become essential tools in the laboratory. They discovered new substances and new processes. They engaged in the actual work of empirical observation and careful technique, all while maintaining a profound belief that matter itself was imbued with sacred meaning and potential. What emerged in Alexandria was a kind of intellectual space that had not existed before. It was not quite philosophy in the Greek sense, though it borrowed from philosophy. It was not quite Egyptian priestcraft preserved unchanged, though it drew deeply on Egyptian knowledge. It was not quite what we would call science, though it involved systematic observation and technique. Instead, it was something hybrid, something that contained all these elements in tension with one another. This tension, rather than being a weakness, gave Hellenistic alchemy its creative force. The alchemists of Alexandria were genuinely trying to answer fundamental questions about the nature of matter and transformation, and they were drawing on every intellectual resource available to them. The works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, whether original compositions from this period or later compilations drawing on earlier traditions, became the touchstone for this new synthesis. Later alchemists would copy and recopy these texts, translate them into Arabic and then back into Latin, add their own commentaries and interpretations. The Hermetic writings became a kind of mirror in which each generation of seekers could see reflected their own understanding of what alchemy was and what it sought. For some, Hermes represented the perfect sage who had achieved unity with the cosmos. For others, he was simply an ancient authority whose words could be cited to validate new discoveries. The very ambiguity of who Hermes was and what he had taught made him an ideal figure for the alchemical tradition to gather around. In the quiet rooms of the museum at Alexandria, in the workshops near the harbor where practical metalwork continued alongside theoretical speculation, something was taking shape that would gradually spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. It was a way of thinking about matter and transformation, a set of practical techniques, a philosophical framework, and a spiritual aspiration all woven together into a single pursuit. The boundary between the practical and the mystical had grown so permeable that it was sometimes impossible to say where one ended and the other began. This would remain true throughout the long history of alchemy. The search for the philosopher's stone was never purely practical, never purely spiritual, never purely philosophical. It was always all three at once, and this multiplicity of meaning would be both its weakness and its enduring strength. Within the great library of Alexandria, among the thousands of papyri and scrolls that lined its corridors, there existed a text so compressed with meaning, so layered with interpretation, that scholars and seekers have spent centuries trying to unpack its 13 sentences. It is called the Emerald Tablet, though whether it was ever carved from emerald, or indeed carved at all, remains one of history's gentler mysteries. What matters is not the material of the tablet itself, but what it was believed to contain. a key to understanding the cosmos and humanity's place within it, a philosophical framework that would shape alchemical thinking from Alexandria to medieval Europe and far beyond. The text is attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, that legendary figure we spoke of earlier, the supposed author of so many Hermetic teachings. Modern scholars believe the Emerald Tablet was likely composed sometime in the early Islamic period, perhaps the 8th or 9th century, though it claims far more ancient roots. The irony is rather beautiful, in a way. The search for the origin of wisdom often leads us not to the beginning, but to the moment when someone believed they had recovered something very old, and perhaps that belief itself was the real treasure being sought. At the heart of the Emerald Tablet lies a single phrase that has echoed through every subsequent age of Western esotericism: as above, so below. It is perhaps the most famous sentence in all of alchemical literature, and also one of the most misunderstood. Let us sit with it for a moment, without rushing past its implications. What could it possibly mean to say that what exists above mirrors what exists below? To our modern ears, it might sound like mere poetry or the kind of thinking we have moved beyond. But to the Hellenistic and medieval mind, it was nothing less than a statement about the fundamental structure of reality itself. Imagine, if you will, standing at the threshold of ancient philosophical thought, where the boundary between physical and metaphysical was far more permeable than we assume today. The statement, as above, so below, articulates a worldview in which the heavens, the realm of the stars, the divine, the eternal, mirror and correspond to the earthly realm of matter, change, and decay. It suggests that the patterns governing the cosmos also govern the human body, the seasons, the metals in the earth. It is not that one causes the other in any simple mechanical way. Rather, they are expressions of the same underlying principles, the same divine language written in different registers. To the alchemist of the medieval period, this was profoundly liberating. If the macrocosm and the microcosm are truly reflections of one another, then by studying the human body, one might unlock the secrets of the universe. By understanding the transformation of materials in a crucible, one might understand the transformation of the soul. By watching metals oxidize and reform, one might glimpse the same renewal that occurs in the cycles of nature. The work of the alchemist became, in this light, not a foolish quest to turn lead into gold for material gain, but a meditation on correspondence, pattern, and the hidden unity beneath apparent diversity. The Emerald Tablet goes on to speak of generation and degeneration, of the single thing that exists at the heart of all creation, of the transformation of the subtle into the gross and the gross into the subtle. These are not instructions for a chemical procedure, though alchemists would read them as such, trying to force literal operations onto symbolic language. Instead, they are descriptions of a cosmos in which everything contains the trace of everything else, in which boundaries between categories, solid and liquid, material and spiritual, earthly and divine, are more fluid than they might first appear. Consider how this might have felt to a medieval scholar laboring in a monastery or a university, caught between the rigid categories of scholastic philosophy on one hand and the mysterious, changeful phenomena of nature on the other. The Emerald Tablet offered a way to think about unity underlying multiplicity, about correspondences rather than separations. The stars did not move according to different laws than the metals in the earth. The human heart did not operate according to different principles than the elements. All participated in the same grand cosmic harmony, the same divine order expressed infinitely throughout creation. This was not, strictly speaking, scientific thinking as we understand it now, but it was something else entirely. It was a way of seeing the world that made the search for hidden patterns feel like a sacred endeavor. And in that impulse toward finding pattern, toward believing that understanding one part of nature might illuminate another, toward trusting that the universe was fundamentally intelligible and unified, we can recognize something that would eventually, over centuries, transform into our modern scientific worldview. The phrase, as above, so below, also embedded within alchemy a kind of humility, though it might not seem that way at first. If the microcosm within us reflects the macrocosm of the universe, then humanity is not separate from nature, but woven into it. The alchemist's laboratory was not a place of dominion over matter, but a place of dialogue with it, a space where the laws governing distant stars could be felt at work in the slow dissolution and recombination of earthly substances. This perspective, that we are not observers standing outside nature, but participants within it, would persist through all the centuries to come, even as the specific language and assumptions shifted and evolved. The cryptic quality of the emerald tablet, its resistance to any single, straightforward interpretation, was not a limitation, but perhaps its greatest strength. Different ages found different meanings in it. Medieval alchemists read it as a literal guide to the great work. Renaissance philosophers saw in it a bridge between Platonism and natural magic. Modern esotericists have interpreted it as a map of consciousness and transformation. Each reading was sincere. Each found something true within those densely packed sentences, even as no single reading exhausted their meaning. There is something deeply human in this, is there not? In our hunger for texts that speak across time, that seem to contain more than they say, that invite us to become active interpreters rather than passive recipients. The Emerald Tablet did not claim to give you answers so much as to invite you into a way of seeing, a perspective from which the world became a text to be read, a system of correspondences waiting to be understood. Yet the golden age of Alexandria, luminous as it had been, could not endure forever. By the 3rd century of the Common Era, the Great Library, that sanctuary where Egyptian mystery met Greek reason, had already begun its slow dimming. The city itself remained powerful, still a center of learning and trade, but something had shifted in the currents of history. The Roman Empire, which had long protected the intellectual ferment of Egypt, was fragmenting. Emperors rose and fell with increasing frequency. The old patronage networks that had sustained the alchemists were loosening their grip. When the library was damaged, whether in the uprising of 272 CE, or through the gradual neglect that followed, the exact moment remains a question scholars still hold gently, uncertainly. Much knowledge was not lost so much as scattered. Imagine, if you will, a vast collection of papyri and vellums, some copied in careful hands, others annotated in margins by readers who had wrestled with their mysteries. These texts did not vanish like smoke. Instead, they moved. They were gathered, hidden, preserved in ways both deliberate and accidental, as if the universe itself were conspiring to keep the flame of alchemical knowledge alive, even as the institution that birthed it crumbled. Some of the most precious manuscripts, those attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, those containing the carefully recorded experiments and observations of generations of Egyptian and Greek practitioners, were transcribed and recopied. In monasteries and private collections, in the hands of monks and scholars who understood that knowledge, once lost, might never return, these texts found refuge. The very fact that Alexandria was declining may have paradoxically saved them, for had they remained in one place, concentrated in a single endangered city, they might have perished entirely when the final great destruction came. But scattered, hidden in different hands across different lands, they survived. This was the period of what we might call the Great Patience. The alchemical corpus did not disappear from the Mediterranean world, not entirely, but it certainly diminished in visibility. The grand public patronage of emperors gave way to the quieter, more obscure work of copyists and preservers. Fewer new discoveries were made, fewer new treatises were written. The sense of urgent, collective pursuit that had characterized the Hellenistic flowering seemed to fade into something more muted, more hesitant. Was the fire of curiosity dimming? Perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply concentrating itself, condensing into smaller, more hidden spaces, preparing for a different kind of renaissance, in a different place. And it is here, in this moment of apparent decline, that something remarkable begins to happen, something that might at first seem like loss, but was actually transformation. As Alexandria's light waned, as the Western Roman Empire itself fragmented into smaller kingdoms, The knowledge that had been created there did not vanish. It migrated. It traveled eastward, following the great trade routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Persian domains and beyond. Some texts were translated into Aramaic, into Syriac, into Arabic. Some were carried by scholars and traders who understood their value. Some were simply absorbed into the intellectual traditions of the Islamic world as that civilization began its own great flowering. This eastward movement of knowledge was not dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, almost imperceptible when viewed from any single moment. Yet when you step back and observe it across centuries, the pattern becomes clear. The alchemical texts that had been carefully preserved in late antique monasteries and private collections, that had survived the fall of Alexandria and the tumult of the declining Roman Empire, were slowly making their way into a new cultural and linguistic context. In Persia, in Mesopotamia, in the territories that would soon become the Islamic Golden Age, scholars were beginning to engage with these ancient writings. Why was this happening? One might wonder at the mechanism of such transmission. The answer, of course, lies in the simple fact that knowledge, once created, has a strange persistence. It wants, in a sense, to be known. Merchants traveling the Silk Roads carried more than spices and silks. They carried ideas. They carried manuscripts. They carried the memory of Alexandria's mysteries. When Arab armies conquered the Persian territories in the 7th century, they did not destroy the intellectual traditions they found there. Instead, they absorbed them, integrated them, and began to study them with fresh eyes and new questions. The decline of Alexandria, then, was not truly an ending. It was more like the dimming of a star, not its extinction, but its transformation into something that could be seen from farther away, that could illuminate other skies. The texts that had once filled the great library, the precise observations and wild theories, the recipes and the meditations on the nature of matter and spirit, all of these would find new readers, new interpreters, new homes. They would be translated, debated, expanded upon. They would become part of a much larger and longer conversation about the possibility of transformation, about the hidden nature of matter, about whether the impossible might not, after all, be quite so impossible as it seemed. For now, in these centuries of transition between the old world and the new, we might imagine those precious manuscripts making their slow journey. A scholar in Syria, carefully copying out the words of Hermes Trismegistus, preserving them against an uncertain future. A merchant buying a worn vellum in a market, not knowing its true value, carrying it eastward. A monk in a monastery, recording what he could understand of these mysterious arts, adding his own notes and reflections in the margins. The knowledge did not burn away. It slept, perhaps. It waited. It prepared for the next chapter of its remarkable history, a chapter that would unfold not in Mediterranean ports, but in the great cities of the Islamic world, where the search for the philosopher's stone would be taken up again with renewed vigor and unprecedented systematic rigor. In the centuries following Alexandria's decline, when the great library had grown quiet and the Mediterranean trade routes shifted their patterns, something remarkable was happening far to the east. The knowledge that had nearly vanished was not lost at all. It had traveled along pathways both visible and invisible, carried by merchants, preserved in monasteries, whispered between scholars in cities that were only beginning to emerge as centers of learning. And in the 8th century, in a place called Baghdad, in the heart of what would come to be known as the Islamic Golden Age, alchemy found not a refuge alone, but a new birth altogether. The fire that had flickered uncertainly in the hands of late ancient practitioners suddenly burned steady and bright, tended by minds that brought to it something the Hellenistic world, for all its brilliance, had perhaps lacked: a commitment to watching, to measuring, to recording what actually happened when substances were heated and combined and allowed to rest. This transformation is often traced to a single figure, though of course, no one person creates an entire era of thought. His name was Jabir ibn Hayyan, and he lived in the 8th century, and if the legends about him are even partially true, he was one of the most prolific and methodical experimenters who had ever lived. The Arabic sources speak of him with a reverence that suggests awe, describing a man so committed to his work that he spent 60 years in a single laboratory, that he wrote, or some say dictated, for his output was so vast it could scarcely be contained in one lifetime, some 300 treatises, perhaps 500 if you include all that is attributed to him across different texts and centuries. What strikes us most vividly now, looking back across those centuries, is not the strangeness of his goals, but the orderliness of his method. Jabir understood something that alchemists before him had grasped only partially, that if you wanted to understand transformation, you had to be systematic about it. You had to repeat your experiments. You had to notice precisely what you added, what you heated, what temperature you maintained, what emerged at the end. You had to write it down. In the laboratories of Baghdad and, later, other cities across the Islamic world, alchemists began to approach their work with a rigor that was almost mathematical. They heated substances to specific heats. They separated mixtures through careful distillation. They synthesized compounds from simpler materials and recorded what they found. They developed new vessels and new apparatuses, refining the technology of investigation itself. And here is something worth pausing over. They were doing genuine chemistry, even though they were working within a framework of transformation that was deeply spiritual, deeply connected to the search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of immortality. These were not incompatible things in their minds. The material world and the spiritual world were interwoven, and understanding one was a pathway to understanding the other. The theoretical framework that guided this work was known as the sulfur-mercury theory, and it was an attempt, ingenious, if ultimately mistaken, to explain the nature of matter itself. The idea was deceptively simple. All metals, all substances, were made of sulfur and mercury in varying proportions. Gold was pure sulfur and pure mercury, perfectly balanced. Base metals contained impurities, corruptions of the ideal ratio. If you could take any metal, lead, copper, iron, and adjust the proportions of sulfur and mercury within it, you could transmute it into gold. This was the underlying assumption, and while it was wrong in its specifics, it was driving alchemists to ask the right kinds of questions. What is matter made of? How are substances related to one another? Can we change one thing into another? These were the questions that, even when answered incorrectly, pushed the entire enterprise forward. And the method by which alchemists in the Islamic world pursued these questions was increasingly rigorous, increasingly tied to observation rather than mere authority or received wisdom. Consider what Jabir himself emphasized in his writings, insofar as we can understand them now through translation and interpretation. He spoke repeatedly of the importance of precision. He wrote about the need to test claims, to repeat procedures, to notice when results varied and why. He documented the properties of substances, their colors, their weights, their reactions to heat and moisture. He kept meticulous records. He trained students in these methods. And though his ultimate goal remained the transmutation of metals and the discovery of immortality, the path he charted toward those goals was the path of empirical investigation. What was he really discovering, even as he sought the philosopher's stone? He was discovering technique. He was discovering apparatus. He was discovering how to carefully heat a liquid until it separated into components. He was discovering how to capture vapors and condense them. He was discovering how to combine substances and observe what emerged. He was, in other words, laying groundwork for chemistry. The remarkable thing about the Islamic Golden Age, from roughly the 8th century through to the 12th or 13th, was not only the individual genius of thinkers like Jabir, but the entire intellectual infrastructure that supported this kind of work. There were libraries and centers of learning. There were patrons who funded research. There were networks of scholars communicating across vast distances. There were translations being made, not only of Greek texts from the classical world, but also of Indian mathematical and astronomical knowledge, creating a synthesis of learning that had never been possible before. Alchemy flourished within this ecosystem. It was supported, funded, debated, refined. And because it was operating within a civilization that valued mathematics and observation, and the recording of knowledge, it developed in ways that might not have happened in Europe or elsewhere. Think for a moment about what this means. The search for the impossible, the transmutation of base metal into gold, was driving the development of real chemistry because it was being pursued systematically, carefully, with attention to procedure and result. The obsession with the philosopher's stone was actually creating the tools and techniques that would eventually be used to understand how matter actually works. The spiritual motivation was producing material progress. How strange and beautiful this is, that human beings seeking the transcendent should end up discovering the physical. And yet there is something else worth noticing. In the Islamic world, alchemy never became quite the all-consuming obsession it would become in later medieval Europe. There was great interest, certainly, and substantial patronage and support, but it existed alongside other forms of knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and was subject to the same standards of logical scrutiny and empirical testing that applied to those other fields. Some Islamic scholars were deeply skeptical of alchemical claims. Others defended the legitimacy of the pursuit. There was, in other words, a debate. There was room for doubt and questioning, even as the work continued. Jabir and his followers were not the only voices in Islamic civilization, but they were important voices, and they shaped the direction that knowledge would take as it, in turn, began to migrate westward, crossing the Mediterranean, entering Europe through Spain and Sicily, ready to transform the medieval world's understanding of what was possible. In the silence of those carefully tended laboratories, where the great Islamic scholars pursued their investigations across centuries, a framework began to emerge. Not a recipe, not a formula written in stone, but a way of thinking about what matter fundamentally was. And at the heart of this thinking stood two primal substances, two opposing yet complementary forces that seemed to explain everything a careful observer might witness in the transformation of materials: sulfur and mercury. Not the liquid silver pooled in a glass vessel, though that substance bore the name, and not the bright yellow powder that burned with acrid smoke, though that too was called by this ancient title. These were principles, conceptual forces that permeated all matter, invisible scaffolding upon which the visible world was constructed. Sulfur represented heat, activity, the masculine principle of combustion and color and transformation. Mercury represented fluidity, receptivity, the capacity to receive form, the vehicle through which change moved through the world. In every substance, from gold to copper to the common stones beneath a city's walls, both principles existed in different proportions, in different balances, locked together in the material lattice. Imagine, if you will, standing beside a scholar in Baghdad or Damascus, watching as he heats a mineral in a sealed vessel. What you are seeing, he would explain with patient certainty, is not merely a chemical reaction, but a cosmic principle playing itself out in miniature. The heat is awakening the sulfur. The mercury is surrendering to the sulfur's influence, shifting, reorganizing. If the proportions could be adjusted perfectly, if the balance could be struck at exactly the moment of greatest potential, what might emerge? A substance of pure perfection, a material that had moved beyond the limitations of ordinary matter. This was the logic that sustained centuries of experiment and observation. It was not mysticism, though it contained elements that later ages would recognize as metaphorical. It was the most sophisticated model these brilliant minds possessed for understanding how matter behaved, how elements might be coaxed toward transformation. The alchemist was not a charlatan fumbling in the dark. He was a natural philosopher, working with the conceptual tools available to him, tools that made a kind of internal sense, even if they ultimately misdirected the search. From this theory grew the belief in the elixir, sometimes called the universal elixir, sometimes the elixir of life. It represented something approaching a universal solvent or catalyst, a substance so refined, so perfectly balanced in its sulfur-mercury proportions, that it could transform any base material into gold, or grant eternal life, or cure any ailment. The alchemist's reasoning held a certain elegance. If all matter consists of sulfur and mercury in various combinations, then a substance of ultimate refinement, of ultimate balance, must possess the power to reorganize any other substance toward perfection. A tincture of such power, applied to base metal, would rewrite its composition. Applied to a human body worn by age and illness, it would restore the original harmony. The search for this elixir consumed not merely the working hours of scholars, but their entire intellectual lives. Decades might be spent perfecting the distillation of a single material, heating and cooling according to precise rhythms, collecting the vapors, condensing them, purifying them again and again. Why such patience? Because each step seemed to bring visible progress. Colors would change. The material would grow purer, more refined. The scholar would see transformation occurring before his eyes, would feel he stood on the threshold of something profound, something just beyond his current reach. What they did not possess was what we might call the modern vocabulary of atomic structure, of chemical bonding, of the distinction between elements and compounds. They could not have known that the transformation they observed was often merely physical rather than transmutative, that heating a substance and collecting its vapors produces a concentration of that same substance, not its elevation to a higher principle. Yet their methods were not entirely without value. In pursuing the elixir, in experimenting with distillation and crystallization, and the careful combination of materials, alchemists stumbled upon genuine discoveries. They learned to isolate acids. They developed new techniques of separation and purification. They created medicines that actually worked, even if their theoretical understanding of why these medicines worked remained fundamentally confused. There was also, woven through all of this, a profound conviction that matter was not inert, not passive, but alive in some sense with potential. A piece of ore was not simply a finished thing, but a possibility waiting to be developed. Every substance contained within itself the capacity to become something else, to be elevated toward greater perfection. This belief, however misguided in its specifics, contained an intuition that would echo forward into modern chemistry and eventually into modern physics. The understanding that matter is dynamic, transformable, far more fluid in its nature than common sense suggests. The elixir itself occupied a strange space in alchemical thinking, sometimes material and sometimes metaphorical. Was it a literal substance you could hold in a vial, a few drops of which would transmute a pound of lead into gold? Or was it a state of being, a spiritual condition that the work of the laboratory was meant to develop within the alchemist's own mind and soul? Different scholars answered this question differently, and the ambiguity itself became productive. It allowed the work to continue, even when material success remained forever elusive. Perhaps the true goal was transformation of the self, not of matter. Perhaps the metals in the retort were symbols for something deeper, for the corruption and refinement of the human soul. Whether this interpretation was original, or whether it developed later as a way to salvage meaning from repeated failures, remains unclear. But the duality between material and spiritual interpretation would come to define much of alchemical practice, particularly as the tradition moved westward into Europe, where religious thought exerted greater influence. The laboratory could be a place of genuine chemical investigation, and it could also be a metaphorical space where the work of transformation occurred at levels of meaning rather than material fact. Often both interpretations existed simultaneously, held together without contradiction, the way different layers of meaning can coexist within a single dream. The knowledge that had flourished in Baghdad and Cordoba, that had been refined in crucibles and alembics across the Islamic world, could not remain forever in the East. Ideas, like water, find their way through the smallest cracks in walls, through trade routes worn by merchants' feet, through the quiet conversations of travelers who carried more than goods. By the 10th century, the slow seeping of alchemical wisdom into Christian Europe had begun, and it would transform not only the continent's understanding of matter, but its very relationship with knowledge itself. Imagine, if you will, the libraries and scriptoriums of medieval monastery rooms, where candlelight flickered across vellum pages and monks bent their attention to the endless work of copying texts. Many of those same monks, in their patient transcription of theological commentaries and biblical verses, would encounter references to alchemical treatises, fragments of something far older and stranger than Christian doctrine. Some of these texts arrived through the most unlikely of doorways: Spain, that peculiar peninsula where Christian kingdoms pushed southward against Islamic rule, where Arabic-speaking scholars and Christian monks lived uneasily but productively in proximity to one another. The Iberian Peninsula became, in many ways, the great translator of alchemical knowledge. In cities like Toledo and Córdoba, which had passed back and forth between Christian and Islamic control, a tradition of translation had taken root. Christian scholars, their curiosity kindled by proximity to Islamic learning, sought out the great works that had been composed in Arabic. They needed interpreters, often Jewish scholars who moved fluidly between Christian, Islamic, and Jewish communities, who carried languages and traditions within themselves like nested boxes. These translators became the crucial bridge, the narrow passage through which 2.5 centuries of alchemical experimentation was beginning to flow westward. One of the most significant of these translators was Gerard of Cremona, an Italian scholar who traveled to Toledo in the 12th century and spent his life rendering Arabic scientific and philosophical texts into Latin. Gerard's hands became the hands through which Western Christianity first encountered the systematic work of Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the Latin world as Geber. The texts attributed to Geber in Latin were not always direct translations of the original Arabic works, and some were composite texts, reinterpretations born from misunderstandings or deliberate reimagining. Yet they carried something essential: the idea that matter could be studied, manipulated, transformed through methodical application of heat and combination. They carried the sulfur-mercury theory, the notion that all metals were composed of these two principles in varying proportions, and that by adjusting those proportions, one might create gold. It seems, from our modern vantage point, a kind of beautiful misunderstanding, an attempt to explain the periodic table in the language of ancient dichotomies. Yet it represented a profound shift in how transformation was conceived. The manuscripts themselves arrived slowly, sometimes in single copies that monks would painstakingly reproduce by hand. A single text of alchemical knowledge might take years to copy, the scribe's eyes straining in dim light, his hand cramping as he rendered Arabic terminology into Latin equivalents, sometimes inventing new words where no precedent existed. How curious it is that knowledge travels at the pace of hand and candlelight, that a single error in transcription might propagate through a dozen subsequent copies, that the geography of ink and parchment shaped what Europe would believe about the nature of matter for centuries to come. By the early 13th century, alchemical texts were circulating in Latin Christendom, though often clandestinely. The Church viewed many of them with suspicion. Alchemy carried associations with Egyptian paganism, with Islamic practice, with a kind of hubris that seemed to challenge the God-given order of creation. Transmuting base metals into gold sounded too much like the heretical ambitions of those who would remake the world according to their own will rather than divine plan. Yet simultaneously, Christian scholars recognized in alchemy something they could accommodate: the notion that matter itself reflected divine principles, that to understand transformation was to glimpse the mechanisms of God's creation. Slowly, carefully, alchemical texts began to circulate, not as forbidden knowledge, but as natural philosophy, as an extension of the theological project to understand divine works through human reason. The transmission was never a simple conveying of knowledge from one vessel to another. Each time a text crossed from Arabic into Latin, each time it passed from a Spanish monastery into Italy or France, it changed. Translators added glosses, interpolations, their own understanding woven into the margins and between the lines. Some alterations were honest attempts to clarify, others reflected the translator's own alchemical experiments or theories. Islamic astronomical and medical concepts, embedded within alchemical treatises, underwent subtle shifts in emphasis and interpretation. The language of mysticism that had suffused Islamic alchemy, the sense that chemical transformation mirrored spiritual development, persisted in these translations, but was gradually reshaped through a Christian lens, so that the goal of the great work became entangled with Christian redemption theology, with the quest for eternal life, with the perfection of the soul itself. One might pause here to consider what it meant for a culture to receive knowledge in this fragmented, mediated fashion. Medieval Christendom could not access the living tradition of Islamic alchemy, could not sit in the presence of a master craftsman and learn through practice and conversation. Instead, it received texts, complex, sometimes contradictory, often obscure. These texts became sacred precisely because they were difficult, precisely because their meanings seemed to shimmer just beyond comprehension. The very opacity of alchemical language, which in the Islamic tradition had partly served to protect knowledge from the uninitiated, now became in Europe a source of fascination, almost of reverence. What was hidden seemed profound, what was unclear seemed infinitely suggestive. The slow, patient work of transmission continued through the 13th and 14th centuries. More texts arrived, more translations were made, more layers of commentary accumulated. By the time Europe entered the late medieval period, alchemical knowledge, reshaped, partially understood, deeply mysterious, had become woven into the intellectual fabric of Christian scholarship. Universities began to teach from translated alchemical texts. Scholars debated their meanings. Practitioners began their own experiments based on these newly acquired recipes and theories. Europe had not simply received alchemy, it had received it transformed, had absorbed it into its own intellectual and spiritual frameworks, and in doing so, had begun the long process of making it into something new. By the time alchemical texts arrived in medieval Europe, they carried with them centuries of accumulated mystery, written in languages few could read and filled with symbols that seemed to hide as much as they revealed. And it was precisely this obscurity that made them precious to a particular kind of mind, one that flourished in the quiet corners of monastery scriptoriums and the emerging universities of Oxford and Paris and Prague. The medieval alchemist was not quite the wild-eyed charlatan of popular imagination, nor entirely the devoted mystic. He occupied a strange, liminal space between faith and inquiry, between the literal search for gold and something far more spiritual that he could never quite name aloud. Consider for a moment the practical reality of medieval monasticism. Monks were the keepers of knowledge, the scribes who had painstakingly preserved what remained of classical learning through centuries of darkness and upheaval. They understood herbs and minerals from their work in monastery gardens and infirmaries. They knew the properties of metals, from the bells they cast and the vessels they crafted. They possessed both the literacy to engage with difficult texts and the isolation that made experimental work possible. In many ways, the monastery was the perfect laboratory, even if no one quite called it that. Hidden from public view, sanctioned by religious authority, as a place of legitimate study and reflection, staffed by men whose vows of poverty meant they could pursue knowledge without the distraction of worldly ambition. And yet, there was a profound tension embedded in this pursuit. The Catholic Church taught that all true knowledge came from God and from Scripture. The search for material transformation, for the transmutation of base metals into gold, carried echoes of forbidden pride, of the human desire to rival the Creator's work. To engage too openly in alchemical study was to risk suspicion, to be marked as someone grasping for powers that belonged only to the divine. So medieval alchemists developed a language of concealment. They spoke in metaphors. They used symbols drawn from Christian theology, from bestiaries, from the natural world. Their texts became labyrinths of meaning, where a single phrase might contain layers of understanding, some literal, some allegorical, some perhaps never fully intended to be unpacked. Was the king and queen who married in the alchemical texts a real chemical reaction, or was it a meditation on the soul's union with God? Both, perhaps. Neither, perhaps. The ambiguity itself became protective. Consider the figure of Albertus Magnus, the German Dominican friar who lived in the 13th century and became one of the great synthesizers of medieval learning. He moved between the monastery and the university, between the contemplative life and the life of teaching and disputation. In his writings on minerals and metals, he described observations that seemed genuinely empirical: the behavior of mercury, the properties of arsenic, the techniques of distillation and dissolution. Yet, he framed these descriptions within the larger philosophy of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, making them part of an orderly cosmos governed by divine law. To read Albertus is to see a mind that believed in careful observation and reasoned analysis, but always as a way of understanding the mind of God, never as an end in itself. This was not hypocrisy or self-deception, but a genuine weaving together of different kinds of knowledge, different ways of knowing. The secrecy that surrounded medieval alchemy was not merely defensive, though it certainly was that. It was also generative. Secrecy created a sense of initiation, of knowledge that had to be earned through study and devotion. It created a sense of community among practitioners, a feeling of belonging to a tradition that stretched back to Hermes Trismegistus and the ancient Egyptians, a lineage of wisdom that was hidden from the profane world. When an alchemist copied a text by candlelight in a monastery cell, pausing over a difficult passage, he was not merely transcribing words. He was participating in a sacred transmission. And this feeling, this sense of participating in something larger than oneself, something that belonged to a hidden history of wisdom, was itself a powerful motivator. The goal of the work, the philosopher's stone, the transmutation of metals, the elixir of life, mattered less, perhaps, than the journey itself, the feeling of being initiated into mysteries. The universities added another dimension to this medieval alchemical culture. In places like Oxford and Prague and Bologna, alchemical knowledge became part of a broader intellectual inquiry into the nature of matter and change. Universities had libraries. Scholars came from across Europe to study. The culture of debate and disputation meant that ideas could be tested and refined. Yet even here, even in these supposedly open spaces of learning, alchemists worked largely in isolation, with their own networks and their own protective secrecy. The study of alchemy at a medieval university was not a formal degree program. It was something pursued privately, often in rented rooms, sometimes with the patronage of a local noble or bishop who was intrigued by the promise of gold or the pursuit of healing medicines. The symbolic language that medieval alchemists developed tells us something crucial about what was actually happening in their workshops and laboratories. When they wrote of the king in his bath, or the red and white substances that must be joined, or the dragon that must devour its own tail, they were not writing mere fantasies. They were using the language of imagery and metaphor to describe processes that they had observed, transformations they had carried out, reactions they had witnessed. The symbols allowed them to work at multiple levels simultaneously. On one level, they could describe a specific chemical process. On another level, they could discuss the spiritual purification that the alchemist himself must undergo. On yet another level, they could explore theological themes of death and resurrection, dissolution and reformation. To a reader in the 21st century, accustomed to precise terminology and literal description, this seems frustrating, even deceptive. But to a medieval reader, it was elegant. It honored the multiplicity of truth, the idea that reality could be understood through different languages and different symbolic systems at once. There was also, it must be said, a genuine excitement in medieval alchemical circles about what might be possible. The transmutation of metals, if it could be accomplished, would mean that the natural order itself could be fundamentally altered. It would mean that the divisions and separations we see around us, the distinction between gold and lead, between sickness and health, between the mortal and the eternal, might be illusions, or at least less permanent than they appeared. This was thrilling and unsettling in equal measure. It suggested that the world was not as fixed and determined as church doctrine might suggest, that there were hidden potentialities, dormant energies waiting to be awakened. For some practitioners, this was experienced as an affront to orthodoxy, For others, it seemed like a natural extension of Christian theology, a way of understanding the infinite creativity of God, the inexhaustible potential of his creation. And then there is the question of fraud, which cannot be avoided when discussing medieval alchemy. Not all alchemists were sincere searchers after truth. Some were charlatans and con artists who promised wealthy patrons that they could produce gold, who used sleight of hand and deception, who disappeared with their patrons' wealth. Yet even this is a more complicated story than it might first appear. Some alchemists who engaged in deception may have believed, at some level, that their work was pointing toward a genuine possibility, that they were simply taking shortcuts or exaggerating slightly. Others were quite cynical, seeing alchemy as an opportunity to prey on the greed and desperation of the powerful. Still others occupied some middle ground, uncertain themselves whether what they were doing constituted fraud or just an optimistic interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The line between genuine inquiry and deliberate deception was not always clear, even to those involved. What remains is the image of the medieval alchemist in his workshop, surrounded by vessels and furnaces, by texts written in cryptic language, by the accumulated instruments of his practice. He was, in many ways, a prototype of the modern scientist, committed to understanding the material world through observation and experiment. And yet he was also something quite different, someone for whom the material world was always a reflection of spiritual realities, for whom the work of transformation was inseparable from personal transformation, from moral and spiritual perfection. This duality, this refusal to separate the material from the spiritual, the practical from the philosophical, is perhaps the most distinctively medieval aspect of medieval alchemy. It represents a kind of knowing that we have largely lost, and whether we have lost something vital or simply grown past a confusion remains an open question, one that alchemists themselves would leave for others to ponder in the quiet hours before sleep. In the laboratories and manuscripts that filled these centuries of searching, something remarkable began to happen. The philosopher's stone was never quite described as a single fixed thing. Instead, it existed in the minds of alchemists as a process, a series of transformations, each marked by a color that shifted like seasons turning in the night. These color stages became, in many ways, the true language of alchemy, not a recipe written in measurements and temperatures, but a poetic vocabulary for the deep mysteries of matter itself. The work began, according to the symbolic tradition, in blackness. This initial stage, called nigredo by Latin writing scholars, represented the breakdown of all things into their most basic substance. Imagine for a moment the ash left behind when fire has consumed everything. In the alchemist's vessel, whatever material they began with, gold, mercury, base metals, plant matter, would undergo a kind of dissolution, becoming dark, formless, apparently worthless. This wasn't failure. Rather, it was the necessary death that must precede rebirth. Medieval practitioners understood this intellectually, but they also experienced it emotionally. To spend months watching your materials turn black and putrid, to wonder if you had wasted months or years, required a kind of faith in the invisible process. The blackness felt like an ending, but it was actually a beginning. From this darkness, if one persisted in the work, would come a gradual lightening. The second stage arrived in white. The Latin word for this transformation was albedo, and it represented purification, clarity emerging from the void. The materials would begin to crystallize, to show signs of new structure forming. In alchemical drawings and descriptions, this stage often appeared as a white swan, or white birds ascending into a pale sky. There was something deeply human in this imagery, the longing to see light return after darkness, to witness something clean and fresh born from corruption. Whether this transformation was literal or symbolic mattered less than the fact that it was real to the alchemist watching it unfold. The emotional journey was as much a part of the work as the chemical one. And then, if the process continued, if the heat remained steady, if the patience held, came the red. This final stage, the rubedo, was where the great prize supposedly lay. The materials would flush with color, with warmth. with what appeared to be life returning. Red represented completion, wholeness, the final flowering of the work. In many alchemical texts, this moment was depicted through the image of the phoenix, the legendary bird that burns completely and rises renewed from its own ashes. The phoenix is perhaps the most perfect symbol alchemy ever created. It embodied the entire journey in a single image: destruction and resurrection, death and rebirth, the old consumed so the new could emerge. Dragons winding around each other, devouring their own tails, appeared again and again in alchemical art. The Ouroboros, as it was called in Greek tradition, represented the cyclical nature of the work. Nothing was wasted, nothing was truly destroyed. Forms changed, materials transformed, but the essential stuff of reality continued moving through endless cycles. When an alchemist drew a dragon eating its tail, they were drawing their understanding of how the universe worked. Not linear, not progressive in any simple sense, but eternally returning to itself, eternally renewing. The image worked because it felt true on multiple levels. You could interpret it chemically, or philosophically, or spiritually, and it held meaning at every depth. These symbols were never meant to be a literal instruction manual. No one, in all the centuries of alchemy, ever found a passage that said, "First make your materials black by heating them to this exact temperature." Rather, the colors and creatures were a language for describing states of matter and stages of transformation that the alchemists didn't yet have the precise vocabulary to explain. How else could you describe the transformation of a solid into a liquid, then into vapor, then back to solid again? How could you communicate the dissolution of one substance into another, the unexpected combinations that produced new properties? The poetic language was actually a kind of wisdom, a way of pointing toward real phenomena through images and stories. When an alchemist spoke of the dragon of Mercury, or the White Queen meeting the Red King, they were describing their observations of how different materials behaved when combined, when heated, when left to age in sealed vessels. The Mercury dragon might refer to the way liquid mercury moves unpredictably, alive seeming in its fluidity. The marriage of the Red King and White Queen in countless alchemical illustrations seemed to describe the moment when two different materials or principles came together and created something entirely new. Behind the mythological language lived genuine observation and genuine mystery. There's a kind of gentleness in this way of working with knowledge, isn't there? Rather than trying to strip away the poetry and see only the bare facts, the alchemists allowed themselves to speak in symbols, in images, in poetic sequences. They weren't avoiding precision so much as they were reaching toward a kind of precision that numbers and straightforward descriptions couldn't provide. How do you measure the wonder of watching one color shift into another? How do you quantify the subtle changes in texture and behavior that signal that something fundamental has shifted? Perhaps poetry is sometimes more precise than we give it credit for. In the sealed vessels of the laboratory, in the careful watching and the patient heat, something was happening that was simultaneously real and symbolic. The materials were genuinely transforming, but the transformation carried meanings that went far beyond chemistry. The nigrido, the blackness of dissolution, spoke to human experiences of loss and confusion. The albedo, the white purity that followed, resonated with hopes of clarity and renewal. And the rubedo, the red flowering of the final work, touched something deep in the human longing for completion and meaning. Perhaps this is why the search for the philosopher's stone continued so persistently, despite the fact that it was never found in the literal, straightforward sense that alchemists hoped. The work itself was never really about producing a physical stone that could turn lead into gold. That was the surface story, the goal that motivated the hands and the heat. Beneath that surface, the entire practice was a meditation on transformation, on the principle that everything can change, that even the basest materials contain hidden potential, that decay and darkness are not the end of the story. In that sense, every alchemist who worked in a darkened laboratory was engaged in a kind of spiritual alchemy, as well as a material one. They were transforming themselves, even as they tried to transform their materials. The symbolism of the stone itself grew richer and more complex as the centuries passed. Some said it was the size of a grain of mustard seed, yet it could transmute infinite quantities of base metal into gold. Others claimed it could cure any disease, grant longevity, even offer a kind of spiritual immortality. The stone that was no stone, the treasure that was priceless yet invisible, the gold that was everywhere and nowhere. These paradoxes were not bugs in the alchemical system. They were features. They were pointing towards something that couldn't be pinned down, that had to be experienced and understood rather than explained. In the symbolic language of alchemy, the philosopher's stone was less a thing to be obtained and more a principle to be understood. And in that understanding, the entire nature of matter, of time, of possibility itself seemed to shift and deepen. And so, through the long corridors of the late medieval world, alchemy had become something quieter than its Islamic Golden Age brilliance. Yet no less alive, practitioners worked in shadow, their texts copied and recopied, their symbols growing more elaborate with each generation. But as the 15th century gave way to the 16th, something began to shift in the European imagination. It was not sudden. Rather, it was like watching the slow bloom of a night-flowering plant, a gradual opening toward new light. The Renaissance, that great awakening of curiosity and classical learning, would pull alchemy in a direction no one quite expected. And at the heart of that transformation stood a figure whose very name became almost synonymous with the power of transformation itself. Philippus Aureolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, known to history by a name he gave himself, Paracelsus. Consider for a moment what Paracelsus represented in the early 1600s. Here was a man who rejected everything the traditional medical establishment claimed to know, where university physicians still clung to the ancient theories of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, all needing to be balanced. Paracelsus looked instead to chemistry itself as the secret to healing. He had wandered Europe as a young man, gathering knowledge from miners, from barber surgeons, from folk healers in the alpine villages, from alchemists he encountered in taverns and laboratories both grand and humble. He returned to the craft not as a searcher for gold or the transmutation of base metals into nobility. Instead, he asked a different question altogether. What if the true gold was not in metal at all, but in medicine? What if the philosopher's stone was not a substance to be discovered in the crucible, but rather an agent of healing for the human body itself? This was a profound reorientation. The entire tenor of alchemical work, which had grown so focused on the laboratory, on the purification of metals, on the elaborate symbolism of transformation, suddenly turned inward. It looked not upward to the stars and the great cosmic mysteries, but downward, into the veins and organs of human suffering. Paracelsus, for all his grandiosity and his sometimes harsh manner, possessed a genuine hunger to relieve pain. He believed that God had placed the cure for every disease within the natural world, and that the alchemist's true calling was to extract it, to concentrate it, to perfect it. He was, in many ways, the first modern pharmacologist, though he would never have known that word. What made this shift remarkable was that it did not abandon the symbolic and spiritual dimensions of alchemy. Rather, it integrated them into something new. When Paracelsus spoke of the elixir, that substance so long sought by Islamic and medieval alchemists, he meant something quite literally different from what his predecessors had imagined. The elixir, in his conception, was a concentrated medicinal essence, often derived from plant material or mineral salts, that could restore health and vitality to the body. It was still imbued with the language of spiritual transformation, yes, but the goal was earthly and immediate: to cure the sick, to extend life, to alleviate suffering. Some even whispered that Paracelsus himself had created such a substance, and that it accounted for his seemingly miraculous healings. Whether this was true or merely legend matters less than the effect it had. It gave practitioners a new reason to pursue their work with urgency and hope. The shift was gradual but pervasive. Throughout the 16th century, as printing presses began to disseminate alchemical texts more widely than ever before, A new genre emerged, medical alchemy, or iatrochemistry, as some scholars called it. The symbols remained familiar: the red king and white queen, the marriage of opposites, the phoenix rising from ashes. But now they were being mapped onto actual chemical processes, onto the distillation of spirits from wine, onto the extraction of tinctures from minerals and herbs. An alchemist might spend months pursuing what they called the great work, and yet their ultimate purpose was not the turning of lead into gold, but the creation of a universal medicine. The stone, in this context, had become less a single objective and more a metaphor for the achievement of perfect health, perfect vitality, the restoration of the body to some imagined original purity. Paracelsus himself died in 1541, in Salzburg, his reputation complex and contested even then. Some called him a genius and a saint, others considered him a charlatan and a braggart. Yet his influence only grew after his death. His followers, and he inspired a devoted following, began to systematize his teachings, to explore the pharmaceutical possibilities he had hinted at. They experimented with mercury compounds, with antimony, with sulfur-based preparations, with the distillation of mineral waters. Some of their experiments were genuinely useful. Others were actively harmful, introducing poisons to the body in hopes of stimulating its own healing powers. But the impulse was sound, even when the method was misguided. They were trying, in their way, to understand how matter worked, how substances could be purified and concentrated, how chemical reactions might be harnessed for human benefit. One can imagine these Renaissance practitioners, in their laboratories, moving through rooms filled with alembics and retorts, with furnaces burning through the night, with vials of colored liquids carefully arranged on wooden shelves. They were no longer seeking to unlock the secrets of cosmic creation, as their medieval predecessors had done. Instead, they were pursuing something more intimate and immediate: the secrets of the body's own chemistry. When they spoke of creating an elixir of life, they meant something they believed they could actually achieve: a substance that would strengthen the heart, sharpen the mind, extend the years of vitality. It was still magical in its way, still suffused with the sense that they were touching upon profound mysteries. But it was also becoming something more practical, more empirical, more rooted in observation and experimentation. The irony, of course, and it is a gentle one, is that in pursuing these medical goals, Renaissance alchemists were developing techniques and acquiring knowledge that would, over time, transform into modern chemistry and modern medicine. They were learning about distillation, about crystallization, about the properties of acids and bases, about how to work with matter in ways that were becoming increasingly systematic and reproducible. The gold they sought in the body's healing was, in the end, far more valuable than any precious metal. Yet they did not fully realize this. To them, they were still working within the ancient tradition, still honoring the great mystery that had captivated minds for 2 millennia. They were simply turning that mystery inward, asking it to speak not of cosmic transformation, but of personal renewal, of bodies made whole, of the human hunger for health, eternal and undying. By the time the Renaissance had fully kindled across Europe, alchemy had transformed from the austere practice of isolated monks into something altogether different, a pursuit that caught the imagination of the most powerful people in Christendom. Kings and princes, emperors and wealthy merchants began to wonder, quietly at first, then with increasing fervor, whether the legends might actually contain truth, and if the philosopher's stone truly existed, might not they be the ones to possess it, to command its power, to reshape their fortunes and their legacies. This shift marked a peculiar turning point in the history of the great work. Alchemy moved from the cloister into the castle, from the monk's candle into the patron's purse. What had been an underground current of knowledge, passed carefully from master to student through coded manuscripts and whispered instruction, now became a matter of court intrigue, of wealth and ambition, intertwined with genuine scientific curiosity. The mixture was as volatile as any experiment conducted in an alchemist's furnace. Consider the courts of the Holy Roman Empire in Prague during the late 1500s. The Emperor Rudolf II, a man of restless intellect and immense resources, became so captivated by alchemy that he assembled what might be called the first modern research institution devoted entirely to the pursuit of transmutation. He gathered alchemists from across Europe, some of them genuine experimenters with real knowledge of metallurgy and mineral chemistry, others charlatans and adventurers who sensed opportunity in the emperor's gold-lined curiosity. Into his palace, Rudolf poured vast sums, constructing laboratories and workshops of unprecedented sophistication, acquiring rare minerals and materials that would have been nearly impossible to obtain anywhere else in the world. These were not crude furnaces in dark corners. Rudolf's alchemical facilities featured precision equipment, glass vessels of remarkable clarity, carefully controlled heating mechanisms, and organized collections of substances sorted with almost scientific intention. The emperor himself would sometimes descend into these hidden chambers at night, watching experiments unfold by candlelight, imagining that at any moment the golden secret might reveal itself. Around him moved a strange assembly, brilliant minds and cunning fraudsters, sometimes indistinguishable from one another, all working under the weight of royal expectation and the promise of extraordinary reward. The appeal for a patron was multifaceted and deeply human. Yes, the prospect of unlimited gold held obvious attraction. A ruler who could transmute base metal into precious would possess wealth beyond measure, power that no rival could match. But beyond this material incentive lay something more subtle. Alchemy represented the ultimate mastery of nature, the ability to pierce the hidden structure of creation itself, to command the very essences of matter. For a Renaissance prince, this was intellectual supremacy made manifest. To sponsor alchemy was to position oneself as enlightened, as visionary, as a patron of the deepest mysteries of existence. Yet within these glittering courts, a strange tension perpetually simmered. Some of the alchemists were genuinely dedicated to their craft, men who had spent decades studying the transformative properties of materials, who conducted systematic experiments and recorded their findings with meticulous care. They saw in patronage not merely an escape from poverty, but the resources to pursue work that their own means could never have funded. For these sincere practitioners, a royal laboratory meant access to rare substances, to time protected from the need to survive through other means, to an audience of educated minds who might understand their work. But alongside these genuine seekers moved another breed entirely, the opportunists who recognized that a desperate patron with unlimited funds represented perhaps the perfect mark. Some were con artists of considerable sophistication, men who had studied just enough alchemical theory to speak convincingly about the great work, while understanding perfectly well that they had no genuine knowledge of transmutation. They arrived at court with impressive credentials, with mysterious manuscripts, with stories of close approaches to success. They spoke of needing just a bit more time, more rare materials, more funds for a final, crucial experiment. They displayed enough actual chemical knowledge, the ability to create impressive color changes, to produce striking reactions, to demonstrate surprising transformations of seemingly base substances, to maintain plausibility while remaining always just on the threshold of the ultimate breakthrough. The patron, in turn, faced an epistemological problem of exquisite difficulty. How could Rudolf or his counterparts truly distinguish between a genuine alchemist approaching the edge of success and a brilliant charlatan? The very nature of the work, the secrecy, the complexity, the genuine scientific elements mixed with philosophical speculation, made verification nearly impossible. An alchemist could always explain failures by claiming that some minute aspect of procedure had gone wrong, that the materials were not pure enough, that the cosmic alignments had been unfavorable, that the operation required another cycle of heating and cooling. Each failure, paradoxically, could be reinterpreted as a learning step, a necessary stage in the approach towards success. And yet, it would be wrong to dismiss these court laboratories as mere theaters of deception. Something genuinely important was often happening within them. even if not the transmutation of lead into gold. Alchemists working with royal resources were conducting real chemical experiments, discovering new reactions and new techniques, isolating new substances. Some of the work being done in these palace workshops, the careful observation of color changes, the precise measurement of temperatures, the systematic variation of procedures, represented a methodological approach that anticipated the empirical methods of modern chemistry. The patron might not have gotten his philosopher's stone, but his investment might have indirectly contributed to the slow foundation building that would eventually produce actual chemical science. This ambiguity is perhaps what made court alchemy so psychologically sustainable. Both patron and practitioner could maintain their hopes, the former because evidence of imminent success was always just plausible enough to believe, the latter because he could genuinely convince himself that his work was valuable regardless of whether the ultimate goal would ever be achieved. There existed a kind of mutual suspension of disbelief, an unspoken agreement that the pursuit itself was what mattered, even if the destination might forever recede before them like a horizon. The most famous such court was perhaps that of Ferdinand II, who invited the Italian alchemist Vittorio de Strada to conduct work in his collection chambers in Vienna. De Strada was by all accounts a man of real learning. He understood metals, minerals, chemical reactions, and had genuine expertise in several aspects of material transformation. Yet even his work ultimately failed to produce the stone, though he produced demonstrations spectacular enough to keep the emperor's hopes alive for years. When de Strada eventually died, still employed, still funded, but never delivering the promised breakthrough, he was remembered not as a fraud, but as a tragic seeker who had come perhaps tantalizingly close to solving the ancient riddle. The infrastructure that surrounded these alchemists tells us much about the period itself. To support an alchemist at court was to build a library of obscure manuscripts, to establish networks of collectors who might procure rare minerals, to maintain craftspeople who could fabricate specialized equipment. Some courts competed with one another to attract the most celebrated practitioners, much as universities today compete for renowned scholars. There was status in having sponsored important alchemical work, even if that work ultimately proved unfruitful. And there was always the possibility, however remote, that one's particular patron, one's particular alchemist, might be the one to finally unlock the secret that had eluded seekers for 2,000 years. And as the centuries accumulated their weight upon the pursuit, something quite human and inevitable began to happen in the shadows of laboratories and court chambers alike. Where there exists genuine yearning, there follows, almost as a law of nature, those who would exploit that yearning. Not all who claimed to command the secrets of transmutation possessed them. Not all who presented themselves as masters of the great work had actually glimpsed even its threshold. Some were simply mistaken, convinced of their own knowledge through the fog of incomplete experimentation. Others were something else entirely, men who recognized that desperation itself was a substance more malleable than gold, more transformable than lead. Consider the position of a nobleman in the 16th century, wealthy beyond ordinary measure, yet haunted by ordinary mortality. He had everything except time, except health, except the promise of endless prosperity for his line. Into this particular void walked a figure draped in mysterious knowledge, eyes bright with certainty, hands stained with the residue of secret processes. Is it so difficult to understand how such a man might suspend his skepticism, how he might fund laboratory after laboratory, year after year, each season bringing fresh promises, each failure reinterpreted as merely the penultimate step before triumph? The human mind performs extraordinary gymnastics when hope is at stake. The courts of Europe became, in a sense, theaters where this peculiar drama played out with almost ritualistic regularity. A man claiming mastery of alchemical arts would arrive, often bearing credentials from other noble houses, sometimes trailing stories of success elsewhere that could never quite be verified, but also could never quite be disproven. He would request funds for materials, rare minerals from distant lands, pure mercury of exceptional quality, furnaces of specific construction. The funds would flow, experiments would commence. Then, at some crucial juncture, an explanation would emerge. The timing was not yet precise. A single ingredient could not be sourced at present. The planetary configurations were unfavorable. A rival alchemist had interfered through malevolent magic. Each excuse possessed just enough plausibility, just enough complexity, that a nobleman accustomed to managing vast enterprises could rationalize patience for one season more. What strikes one, studying these patterns from across the centuries, is not the cruelty of the deceivers, but rather the profound loneliness of the seekers. These were not typically simple men without education. Many were learned, versed in philosophy, capable of understanding complex theoretical frameworks. Yet they desired so intensely what the philosopher's stone promised, not merely wealth, for most already possessed that, but rather a fundamental reordering of existence itself, the conquest of mortality, the elevation of the base to the divine. Against such desire, reason becomes a whisper easily drowned out. There were those, certainly, whose fraud was deliberate and calculated from the start. Men who had studied enough genuine alchemical texts to sprinkle their performances with convincing details, who understood that most observers lacked the technical knowledge to distinguish between authentic processes and elaborate theater. They would arrange dramatic demonstrations. Dramatic, yes, but not quite impossible. A volatile reaction would occur. Sparks would fly. Colors would shift in the alchemical furnace. Then, in a moment of distraction or carefully orchestrated confusion, a prepared substance would be introduced. The desired transformation would appear to occur. "Did you not see it yourself?" the noble would ask his witnesses, as the base metal seemed to shimmer and shift toward golden hue. And if afterwards, under careful scrutiny, the gold proved somehow less than pure, well, the work was not yet complete, was it? The final refinement would require more time, more funds, more faith. Yet here rests a paradox worth contemplating as you drift deeper into contemplation of human nature itself. Some of history's greatest alchemists, men whose genuine contributions to chemistry and medicine were substantial, were also themselves duped at various points. They pursued transmutation so sincerely that they constructed elaborate rationalizations when their experiments failed to yield the promised results. They published treatises dense with symbolic language, partly to preserve knowledge from the uninitiated, partly because the symbolic language itself created interpretive flexibility. If an experiment did not work, the symbols could be reinterpreted. If materials seemed incorrect, perhaps they had been understood wrongly. The very opacity that protected alchemical knowledge also made it nearly impossible to distinguish between legitimate mystery and self-deception. There emerged, over time, a particular type of charlatan who was almost worse than the straightforward fraud, because he may have believed his own claims. He had read the texts, performed the operations, experienced the genuine awe that comes from manipulating matter and observing transformations. He had seen Mercury behave in unexpected ways, had witnessed reactions that seemed to violate the ordinary laws of matter, had breathed vapors that altered consciousness and perception. Was it so surprising that he attributed these experiences to proximity to divine knowledge? That he convinced himself he stood on the precipice of ultimate discovery? The relationship between patron and alchemist often developed a strange intimacy, born of their mutual investment in impossibility. They were, in a sense, collaborators in a necessary fiction. The nobleman needed to believe that transmutation remained perpetually possible, always one more experiment away. The alchemist needed to believe this as well, because without it, his identity and purpose evaporated. They supported each other's delusions, not through malice, but through a kind of tender mutual understanding. When did the moment come, if it ever came, when one or both recognized the truth? When desperation transformed into acceptance? History rarely records such private recognitions. The tragedy that wound through these stories was not primarily the loss of money, though certainly fortunes were exhausted. It was rather the loss of possibility itself, A nobleman who has funded fruitless experiments for decades eventually stops seeking. An alchemist who has never achieved the great work, but has spent his years pursuing it, approaches the end of life, having found nothing but failure. Yet even in this, there was a subtle alchemy of its own, the transformation of human hope, compressed under pressure and heat for decades, into something harder and more durable than hope, a kind of resignation that was almost, though not quite, wisdom. What remains curious, drifting now through the quietness of historical hindsight, is that genuine knowledge accumulated during these centuries of mixture between sincerity and fraud, between calculation and delusion. The furnaces produced better techniques for heating, for distillation, for observation of chemical processes. The search for the philosopher's stone, even when conducted by frauds, generated experimental data. The texts written by charlatans and believers alike contained, interspersed among the mysticism and metaphor, actual discoveries about how matter behaves. In this way, the very failure of alchemy to achieve its impossible goal became paradoxically productive. The attempt spawned something that would, in time, become actual chemistry, a transformation not of lead into gold, but of human understanding itself. As the 17th century drew near, something peculiar began to happen in the minds of Europe's most rigorous thinkers. The boundary between alchemy and what we might call proto-chemistry started to blur, then shift, then finally dissolve, like salt in warm water. And yet the transformation was never a rejection of alchemy, so much as a gradual refinement, a patient distillation of the mystical into the measurable. The alchemists had been asking the right questions all along. They simply lacked the instruments and the language to frame the answers. Consider for a moment the figure of Robert Boyle, born in 1627 into the Anglo-Irish gentry. By any measure, Boyle was a creature of the New Age. He believed fervently in careful observation, in repeatable experiment, in keeping meticulous records of what actually happened rather than what ancient texts promised would happen. And yet, and this is the peculiar grace of the moment, Boyle never renounced alchemy. He spent decades pursuing transmutation alongside his more celebrated work on gases and atmospheric pressure. He kept his laboratory experiments secret, corresponded in cipher with other alchemically minded scholars, and filled notebooks with diagrams and procedures that had as much in common with the medieval tradition as with the new empirical method. What changed was not his belief in transformation, but his insistence that transformation must be witnessed, recorded, and reproduced. He was still seeking the philosopher's stone, but now he wanted proof. The paradox deepens when we turn to Isaac Newton, whose reputation rests almost entirely on the foundations of classical mechanics and mathematical certainty. Here was a man who derived the laws of motion, who explained gravity itself, who changed forever how the human mind understood the physical world. And here too was a man who spent a staggering portion of his intellectual energy on alchemical manuscripts. Scholars have only recently, in the last few decades, begun to appreciate the true scope of Newton's alchemical work. He owned over 100 books on the subject. He filled thousands of pages with alchemical notes, procedures, and cryptic diagrams. The furnaces at his Cambridge residence were stoked with the same intensity as his telescope. He was searching, earnestly and systematically, for the secret of metals, for the hidden unity of matter, for the transmuting fire that earlier generations had pursued through metaphor and mystical intuition. What makes this moment so extraordinary, and perhaps so restful to contemplate, is that Newton did not see a contradiction between his mathematics and his alchemy. Both were expressions of the same hunger to understand the hidden order of nature. Both required precision. Both demanded that he set aside received opinion and look directly at what was actually present before his eyes. The alchemists had taught him the value of patience, of close observation, of trusting experiment over dogma. The new experimental philosophy taught him to measure what he observed, to quantify it, to express it in language that could be tested by others. These were not enemies. They were methods converging slowly towards something more powerful than either alone. The transmission of this synthesis across Europe was neither swift nor uniform, but it was persistent. In Paris and London, in Amsterdam and Leipzig, the community of natural philosophers, as they styled themselves, began to adopt what we might call an alchemical attitude toward chemistry. That is, they maintained the alchemist's sense that matter held secrets, that transformation was possible, that hidden connections bound apparently disparate substances together. But they abandoned the alchemist's reliance on correspondence and analogy as proof. They demanded experimental validation. They published their findings, submitted them to scrutiny, built on the work of others rather than hoarding knowledge in secrecy. Consider the incremental way this shift manifested. Where medieval alchemists had spoken of the queen and the king uniting in the alembic, early modern chemists began to identify specific substances, sulfur, mercury, salt. Where the old texts had referred to the white stone and the red stone as stages in the great work, researchers began to describe the actual color changes that occurred as various reactions proceeded. Where alchemy had been cryptic by necessity and inclination, chemistry aspired to clarity. And yet the underlying conviction that matter was not inert, that transformation was nature's deepest truth, that the humble and base could become refined and precious, this conviction passed intact from one tradition to the other. The alchemical tradition, it bears noting, did not vanish. Even as chemistry established itself as a discipline bound by experimental method and mathematical expression, alchemy persisted in the shadows, in the margins, in the laboratories of those who still believed that something essential had been lost in the translation. Certainly by the 18th century, as chemistry became increasingly professionalized and increasingly separated from medicine and philosophy, alchemy had receded from the mainstream of European intellectual life. Yet the dream did not die. It transformed, as perhaps all dreams do, into something stranger and more private. What the transition from alchemy to chemistry ultimately reveals is something quite human and rather beautiful. It shows us how knowledge evolves not through wholesale rejection, but through patient incorporation, how the obsessions of one generation become the tools of the next. The philosopher's stone was never found because it was never truly a stone. It was a symbol of the deepest human hope, that understanding matter means gaining power over it, that secrets exist to be uncovered, that the world is rational and knowable and fundamentally transformable. These hopes did not die when alchemists faded from history. They were reborn in the laboratories of Boyle and Newton and their inheritors, wearing new clothes, speaking a new language, but animated by the same restless conviction that lay beneath the surface of the medieval quest. And as this long story of seeking continued to unfold, layered now with the weight of measurement and proof, the world was slowly remade, not by the turning of base metal into gold, but by something perhaps more revolutionary, the transformation of human ignorance into human knowledge, piece by careful piece. And yet, standing here at the threshold of our own age, we must ask a question that alchemists asked every moment of their lives. What does it mean that something never existed and yet transformed everything? The philosopher's stone was never found, not in a crucible, not in a furnace, not in the hidden vaults of Prague or the secret chambers of Alexandria. No one holds it now. No museum preserves it behind velvet rope and glass. The great work remained, in literal terms, eternally incomplete. And this incompleteness is perhaps the most profound truth the alchemists left us. It would be easy to imagine that this failure, this 2,000-year pursuit of an object that never materialized, represents wasted effort, centuries squandered in delusion. But something curious happened along the way. In attempting to transform lead into gold, in trying to create the universal solvent, in seeking the elixir of eternal life, alchemists were actually learning something far more durable than any metal could be. They were teaching themselves the language of matter itself. When Jabir ibn Hayyan heated minerals and recorded what happened, he was not simply dreaming, he was beginning to map the behavior of elements. When a medieval monk ground cinnabar and mercury together, writing careful notes in lamplight, he was performing, whether he knew it or not, an early form of empirical observation. When Paracelsus insisted that physicians must understand chemistry, that the body was a furnace to be comprehended through the principles of transmutation, he was gesturing toward the birth of biochemistry, though centuries lay between his intuition and our understanding. The paradox deepens when we consider that those who finally bridged the gap between alchemy and chemistry, men like Robert Boyle and Isaac Newton, did not reject alchemy. They inherited it. Newton, whose laws of motion and gravity would reshape how we understand the universe, spent years studying alchemical texts. He annotated them carefully. He did not view alchemy as superstition to be abandoned, but as a partially glimpsed truth waiting to be refined. Boyle, often called the father of modern chemistry, believed in the transmutation of metals, not because he was credulous, but because the emerging science he was developing suggested that matter was far more fluid, far more capable of transformation than anyone had previously proven. The medieval dream of turning one element into another had been, in a sense, correct. It would simply require nuclear physics to accomplish it, and that lay 3 centuries ahead. So the philosopher's stone was never found, and perhaps it was never supposed to be, not as a lump of matter that could be held in the hand. Rather, it transformed into something else entirely. It became methodology. It became the scientific method itself, the patient, systematic observation of nature, the keeping of careful records, the willingness to fail and to learn from failure, the slow accumulation of understanding through experiment. The gold the alchemists sought became the knowledge they accumulated in pursuit of it. This teaches us something tender about human longing, something that echoes even now, in our time. We search for things that may not exist in the form we imagine. We pursue perfect solutions, miraculous transformations, shortcuts to healing and wholeness. And yet, in the searching itself, in the genuine, patient, curious reaching toward understanding, something real takes shape. The seeking becomes the finding. The philosopher's stone also reshaped medicine in ways we still inhabit today. Medieval and Renaissance alchemists, in their obsession with the elixir of life, with the quintessence that could restore vitality and cure disease, began to systematically study plant extracts, mineral compounds, and the properties of substances. Some of these endeavors led nowhere, but others, the careful distillation of herbs, the understanding that certain minerals held pharmaceutical properties, the very concept of an active ingredient in a substance, these were genuine advances. Alchemy did not give us the elixir, but it gave us the first systematic pharmacy. It gave us the idea that disease could be addressed chemically, that the body's disorders might be healed through understanding and manipulating the substances within and around us. Later, when doctors could finally explain why an herb worked, when they could isolate its active compound, understand its biochemical pathway, they were finishing work that alchemists had begun centuries before. The hunger for transformation, too, never died. It simply changed shape. It moved from the dream of gold into the dream of flight, into medicine that might extend life far beyond its natural span, into the manipulation of matter at scales so small they seemed almost alchemical, breaking apart the very atoms that the ancients had believed indivisible, rearranging them according to will and understanding. The desire to transform lead into gold evolved into the desire to transform ourselves, our genes, our disabilities, our mortality. The impulse remained, only the vocabulary changed. And there is something almost gentle in this realization. The alchemists were not fools who believed impossible things. They were human beings possessed of a vision of transformation so powerful, so necessary, that it drove them to work despite all evidence that their literal goal could not be achieved. They were willing to fail. They were willing to work by candlelight, to poison themselves with mercury, to lose fortunes seeking something that might not exist, because the search itself, the act of careful attention paid to the nature of matter, was worth doing. There is a kind of faith in that, not faith in the supernatural, but faith in understanding. Faith that reality, if studied patiently enough, would yield its secrets. So when we ask, in the quiet of late evening, why the philosopher's stone was never found, perhaps the answer settles over us, like the realization that the seeking itself was the transformation. The alchemists changed the world not by succeeding in their stated task, but by remaining obsessed with understanding it. They wanted to change lead into gold, and instead, they changed how humans think about matter, about transformation, about the patient work of understanding the natural world. This is a different magic than they imagined, but perhaps it is the deeper one, the ability to observe, to experiment, to learn, to build knowledge upon knowledge. This is the real transmutation, not the changing of one metal into another, but the changing of darkness into light, ignorance into understanding, the slow and patient transformation of the human capacity to know. And in that light, the philosopher's stone was found long ago. It was just not what anyone expected. And so we return, as perhaps we always must, to that quiet space where the search began. The workshop is still there, you see, unchanged in its essentials across the centuries. The candle flickers as it did 500 years ago, casting the same restless shadows against stone walls. The alchemist sits as he might have sat on any night in any era, surrounded by the apparatus of transformation. Glass retorts catch and release the amber light. Copper vessels settle into darkness. The smell of minerals and dried herbs hangs in the still air like a gentle memory. There is something deeply human in what happened in rooms like this one. For 2,000 years, men and women looked at the world and asked the deepest possible questions. What is matter, truly? How might we change one thing into another? Can the body be made immortal? Can sickness become health? These were not foolish inquiries, even when the answers they pursued turned out to be unreachable. Even when the methods they used were sometimes misguided, there was genuine longing there, real curiosity, an ache in the human heart to understand the secret language of the universe. The philosopher's stone was never found, at least not in the way they imagined it. There are no hidden vials in forgotten castles, no crystalline objects waiting to be discovered in lost tombs. The goal itself was perhaps always an illusion, a symbol grasping at something true, but utterly beyond the reach of their hands. And yet it shaped everything. Every failed experiment taught something. Every disappointment pushed toward a new method. The careful observations made in seeking the impossible became, gradually, the foundation of what we recognize today as science itself. Newton bent over his furnaces. Boyle measured with precision. Lavoisier brought order to the confusion. They inherited the alchemists' patient obsession and transformed it into something the alchemists themselves could scarcely have imagined. The stone never arrived, but the search itself did not fail. It simply became something else, something deeper. It became the modern world. And now the workshop grows quieter still. The flame of the candle is burning low, has perhaps been burning low for some time. And you notice this only now, as your attention softens. The alchemist has set down his tools. There is no more work to be done tonight. The retorts will cool. The mercury will settle into stillness at the bottom of its vessel. The furnace will grow dark as the embers fade to ash. Tomorrow there will be new preparations, new theories to test, new hope that the answer lies just beyond the next experiment. But tonight there is only rest. The search, you might realize, was never really about arrival. It was about the journey itself, the gentle unfolding of mystery across years and decades and centuries. It was about standing in the presence of the unknown and reaching toward it anyway. That impulse never truly leaves the human heart. We still reach. We still ask. We still hope that transformation is possible. And perhaps that reaching, that eternal reaching, is itself the true stone we were always looking for, the thing that makes us alive, the thing that keeps us moving forward even when we cannot see the destination. The workshop is growing darker now. The last light from the candle barely touches the far corners. The shadows deepen into places where you cannot quite see. The air is becoming cooler, or perhaps you are simply becoming more aware of the coolness that was always present. There is a quality to this darkness that is not frightening. It is restful. It is complete. All the questions that were asked here, All the reaching and hoping and striving, all of it seems very far away now, very peaceful, very distant. The alchemist is sleeping now, you might imagine, or preparing to sleep. The night is deep. The stars outside the narrow window have wheeled through their arc across the sky. Somewhere a bell is ringing the late hour, though it is so far away that you can barely hear it. Or perhaps you only hear it in your own half-dreaming mind, where distinctions between sound and silence have begun to blur together. There is nothing more to discover tonight. The work is complete. The search, which began in the hot deserts of Egypt so many centuries ago, which burned bright in the laboratories of Baghdad, which filled the hidden rooms of European castles with hope and obsession and genuine wonder, has come to this quiet place, this moment, this rest. And there is something profound in that arrival, even if it is not the arrival anyone expected. Not the stone, not the elixir, not immortality or infinite gold, but something simpler and more enduring. The knowledge that the search itself was sacred, that the reaching was enough, that the questions matter more than the answers. The candle is nearly out now. Just the smallest flame remains, a tiny point of warmth in the surrounding dark. And as it flickers and sways with drafts you cannot feel and cannot hear, you begin to understand that all of this, the 2,000 years, the countless laboratories, the endless experiments, the failures and the breakthroughs and the beautiful, persistent human refusal to stop wondering, all of it has been leading not to some distant discovery, but to this, to silence, to stillness, to the permission to let go of seeking and simply rest. The stone was never found, but perhaps, in the deepest chambers of sleep, in those spaces where the searching mind finally falls silent, and the yearning heart finally finds its ease, perhaps something far more valuable has been discovered all along. Not an object, not a solution, but a profound acceptance of mystery itself. The understanding that some questions are most beautiful, precisely because they cannot be answered. That the search is not a journey towards something external, but an awakening to something within. And that rest, true rest, comes not when the quest is complete, but when you finally understand that the quest itself is complete in every moment you choose to live it. The workshop fades now. The candlelight becomes memory. The tools and vessels and furnaces dissolve gently into the background, as if they were never quite solid in the first place. And what remains is only this, the soft sound of your own breathing, the gentle weight of rest settling over you like the finest dust of precious metals, gathering and accumulating until you are no longer separate from the darkness but part of it. The alchemist's eternal dream continues, night after night. In laboratories you will never see, and by candlelight you will never need to understand. And you too are part of that great search now, the seeker and the sought, the searcher and the silence, one and the same, drawing slowly, gently, inevitably toward the longest, deepest rest.